March 28, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Hallett Beatty rammed HMS Campbeltown into the dock gates at St. Nazaire, France, at 20 knots, while German shore batteries poured fire into his ship from 300 yards away. Beatty was a 28-year-old Royal Navy destroyer commander leading the most audacious Commando raid of World War II. His ship, an obsolete American destroyer packed with 5 tons of delayed action explosives hidden in its bow, was a floating bomb designed to destroy the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast large enough to service the German battleship Tirpitz. The mission was suicide dressed up as strategy. Sail 400 miles into enemy-controlled waters, penetrate a heavily defended French port, ram a destroyer into a massive dock gate, evacuate 265 commandos who would demolish port facilities, then somehow escape back to England before German reinforcements arrived. British planners calculated casualties at 80%. The commandos called it the greatest raid of all. German defenders would later call it the boldest commando operation of the war. Beatty's ship struck the dock gates at 01:34 hours and wedged itself into the structure. Commandos poured off the destroyer and began their demolition work, while German defenders fired from every building, every rooftop, every corner of the port. The fighting lasted 6 hours. When it ended, 169 British soldiers and sailors were dead or captured. The raid appeared to be a catastrophic failure. Then, at 10:35 hours, 9 hours after impact, the explosives hidden in Campbelltown's bow detonated. The dock gate disintegrated. The dry dock flooded and collapsed. Tirpitz would never use St. Nazaire. The suicide mission had succeeded. This is the story of Operation Chariot, the raid that should have failed but didn't. By March 1942, the German battleship Tirpitz represented Britain's greatest naval nightmare. Tirpitz was the most powerful warship in European waters, 52,600 tons fully loaded, 8 15-inch guns, 12 5.9-inch secondary guns, 12.6 inches of armor plating, top speed 31 knots. She was larger than any British battleship and faster than anything that could match her firepower. If Tirpitz broke out into the Atlantic, she could destroy convoy after convoy, cutting Britain off from American supplies. The Royal Navy would have to commit multiple capital ships to hunt her down, ships desperately needed elsewhere. Tirpitz's mere existence tied down significant British naval resources. The German Navy kept Tirpitz in Norwegian fjords, protected by mountains, anti-aircraft batteries, and fighter cover. Attacking her there was nearly impossible. The Royal Navy had tried. Aircraft raids damaged her but didn't sink her. She could be repaired. What worried British planners was a scenario where Tirpitz broke out, raided convoys, then retreated not to Norway but to France, where she could be repaired in one of the massive dry docks the Germans had captured. The only dock on the Atlantic coast, large enough to service Tirpitz, was the Normandy dock at St. Nazaire. This dock was enormous, 1,148 feet long, 164 feet wide, capable of holding the largest ocean liners in the world. It had been built in the 1930s to service the French ocean liner SS Normandy. When Germany conquered France in 1940, they captured St. Nazaire and its massive dry dock intact. If Tirpitz could use St. Nazaire, she could operate in the Atlantic indefinitely, retreating to France for repairs after each raid. British planners concluded, destroy the Normandy dock, and Tirpitz loses her Atlantic safe harbor. Without St. Nazaire, Tirpitz must return to Germany or Norway for repairs. That means sailing through the North Sea where the Royal Navy can intercept her, destroy the dock, and you neutralize Tirpitz without sinking her. The problem was destroying the dock. Air raids had proven ineffective. The dock was heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns, and even direct bomb hits wouldn't necessarily destroy the massive gates and pumping machinery. A naval bombardment was impossible. St. Nazaire was 6 miles up the Loire River estuary, too shallow for capital ships. The only way to destroy the dock was to get inside the port and place demolition charges precisely where they would do maximum damage. Combined Operations Headquarters, responsible for planning Commando raids, developed a plan that was audacious to the point of insanity. Pack an old destroyer with explosives, sail it into St. Nazaire at high speed, ram it into the dock gates, evacuate the crew and commandos who would demolish other facilities, then escape in small motor launches before German reinforcements arrived. The destroyer would explode hours later, a delayed fuse to allow the raiders time to escape, and the dock would be destroyed. The plan required perfect execution under impossible conditions. The destroyer would have to penetrate German-controlled waters for 400 miles without detection. It would have to navigate a river estuary at night with perfect precision, 1 degree off course, and it would run aground. It would have to ram the dock gates at exactly the right angle and speed. Too slow, and it wouldn't penetrate. Too fast, and it might sink before commandos could disembark. Then 265 men would have to fight their way through a heavily defended port, demolish targets, and escape before being killed or captured. The mission was so unlikely to succeed that many officers privately called it suicide. In January 1942, Combined Operations selected HMS Campbeltown for the mission. Campbelltown was a Town-class destroyer originally built for the U.S. Navy in 1919 as USS Buchanan. She was old, slow, and obsolete, but had one critical advantage. Her shallow draft allowed her to navigate the Loire estuary at high tide. The Royal Navy had acquired her in 1940 under the Lend-Lease Agreement, when Britain was desperate for escort vessels. Naval engineers converted Campbelltown into a floating bomb. They removed most of her weapons to reduce weight. They welded steel plating over her deck to protect commandos during the approach. They disguised her silhouette to resemble a German Muwa-class torpedo boat. From a distance, German defenders might mistake her for a friendly vessel. Most critically, they built a concrete and steel chamber in her bow and filled it with 4.5 tons of Amatol high explosive packed in depth charges with 8-hour delayed action fuses. The chamber was hidden behind a false bulkhead. From outside, Campbelltown looked like a slightly modified destroyer. Inside, she was a time bomb. The commandos selected for the raid came from No. 2 Commando, an elite unit trained in small unit tactics, demolitions, and night fighting. The commandos were divided into assault groups and demolition teams. Assault groups would secure the dock area and suppress German defenders. Demolition teams would blow up specific targets: the dock's pumping station, winding houses that controlled the gates, U-boat pens, port facilities. Every man was assigned a specific objective. Everyone trained extensively on scale models of St. Nazaire built from aerial reconnaissance photographs. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty was appointed to command HMS Campbeltown for the raid. Beatty was an experienced destroyer captain with a reputation for calm under pressure. He was told directly that his ship would not return from St. Nazaire. It would be rammed into the dock gates and destroyed. Beatty accepted the mission without hesitation. His crew of 75 sailors volunteered when told the mission was dangerous. None were told the full plan, that their ship was packed with enough explosives to obliterate a city block. The flotilla for Operation Chariot consisted of HMS Campbeltown, 16 small motor launches, MLs, that would carry commandos, and a motor gunboat, MGB, for command and control. The motor launches were wooden vessels, 112 feet long, armed with light weapons designed for coastal patrol. They were fragile and would be torn apart by German shore batteries. But they were fast, capable of 20 knots, and could navigate shallow water. The plan called for Campbeltown to ram the dock gates. Then the motor launches would pull alongside the destroyer to evacuate commandos and crew. The launches would then race back down the Loire estuary and escape to sea while German forces were still responding. Training for the raid was conducted in absolute secrecy at Falmouth in southwestern England. The commandos practiced boarding and disembarking from moving vessels. They rehearsed demolition procedures. They memorized the layout of St. Nazaire. Nobody was told where the raid would take place. Operational security demanded that only senior officers knew the target. The commandos were simply told to train for a raid on a heavily defended port, requiring precision timing and aggressive action. On March 26, 1942, the flotilla departed Falmouth. As they sailed, senior officers briefed the men on the actual target, St. Nazaire. The reaction was shock mixed with grim determination. Everyone understood this was a one-way mission for many. The briefing included casualty estimates: 30% killed, 50% captured. Only about 20% expected to return. Nobody backed out. The flotilla sailed 400 miles across the Bay of Biscay toward the French coast. German aircraft spotted them on March 27th. A Heinkel He-111 bomber circled the flotilla at a distance, clearly radioing a report. This was the disaster scenario. If Germans knew British forces were approaching, St. Nazaire's defenses would be on full alert. The raid would sail into a prepared defense. But the flotilla continued. There was no abort signal. The mission proceeded. As night fell on March 27th, the flotilla approached the Loire estuary. The plan required arriving at high tide. Only then would there be sufficient water depth for Campbeltown to reach the Normandy dock. High tide was at 01:30 hours on March 28th. Timing had to be perfect. Arrive too early, and they would run aground. Arrive too late, and the tide would be falling, making escape difficult. At 22:30 hours, the flotilla passed the outer defenses of St. Nazaire. German searchlights swept the estuary, but didn't detect the ships initially. Campbeltown led the formation, her disguised silhouette making her resemble a German vessel. The motor launches followed in 2 columns. Navigation was by dead reckoning. The estuary was unlit, no navigation aids, just charts and calculations. Lieutenant Commander Beatty stood on Campbeltown's bridge, watching the dark shoreline, estimating distance and bearing, adjusting course by degrees. At 01:20 hours, German searchlights illuminated Campbeltown. A signal station ashore challenged the ship by lamp. "Identify yourself." The British had prepared for this. Campbeltown signaled back in German using codes captured from a German submarine weeks earlier. "Friendly vessel, escorting damaged ships, request permission to enter harbor." The German signalman accepted the identification. The searchlights turned off. The flotilla continued upriver. For 12 minutes, the deception worked. Campbeltown and the motor launches sailed 3 miles up the Loire estuary toward the Normandy dock, while German defenders assumed they were friendly. Then, at 128 hours, a German officer at the harbor headquarters became suspicious. The codes Campbeltown was using were outdated. He ordered searchlights turned back on and guns to open fire. Every German gun position in St. Nazaire opened fire simultaneously. Shore batteries with 80 mm and 75 mm guns. Anti-aircraft positions with 20 meters and 37 mm weapons. Machine guns from rooftops and bunkers. The entire port erupted in fire. Campbeltown was 6 minutes from the dock gates, traveling at 20 knots, committed to the attack run. There was no turning back. Shells struck Campbeltown's superstructure. The bridge was hit repeatedly. Men were killed at their stations. The helmsman was wounded, but held the wheel, keeping the ship on course. Beatty stood in the shattered bridge, watching the dock gates grow larger, estimating distance, calling course corrections. 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 3 minutes. The destroyer was being torn apart by gunfire, but the engines were intact, the steering functional, the bow still pointed at the dock gates. At 0134 hours, HMS Campbeltown struck the center of the Normandy dock's southern caisson gate at 19 knots. The bow crushed against the massive steel structure and rode up onto the gate, penetrating 36 feet into the structure. The destroyer was wedged into the gate, immovable, exactly as planned. The time delay fuses in the bow explosives were activated. Countdown to detonation, 8 hours. Commandos poured off Campbeltown's deck onto the dock before the ship had fully stopped. German defenders were everywhere, firing from buildings, from rooftops, from bunkers. The commandos charged into the gunfire, racing toward their assigned objectives. Assault teams suppressed German positions with automatic weapons fire. Demolition teams carried 50-pound packs of explosives toward the pumping station, winding houses, and U-boat pens. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, commanding the commandos, established a perimeter around the dock while demolition teams worked. German resistance was fierce. The port garrison had been alerted by the German aircraft that spotted the flotilla hours earlier. Wehrmacht troops were moving toward the dock. The commandos were outnumbered at least 5-1 and had no heavy weapons. The motor launches were supposed to evacuate commandos after demolitions were complete. Most never made it to the dock. German shore batteries destroyed 8 motor launches in the first 15 minutes. The wooden vessels caught fire and sank rapidly. Survivors swam in burning fuel oil. Other launches, seeing the carnage, attempted to evacuate commandos, but were shot to pieces while alongside the dock. Of 16 motor launches that entered the Loire estuary, only 4 survived to escape to sea. The demolition teams worked under fire. Sergeant Thomas Durrant's team reached the pumping station that controlled the dock's water level. They placed explosive charges on critical machinery, set timers, and withdrew. The charges detonated, destroying pumps that could never be economically repaired. Another team destroyed the winding house that operated the dock gates machinery. A third team demolished facilities at the old entrance to the harbor. The commandos were executing their mission perfectly, despite catastrophic casualties. Captain Roy's team attempted to destroy U-boat pens but couldn't penetrate the massive concrete structures. The pens were 16 feet of reinforced concrete, effectively indestructible. Roy's team ran out of time as German counterattacks intensified. They withdrew, fighting running gun battles through the port. By 03 hours, the situation was desperate. Most of the motor launches were sunk or destroyed. Hundreds of German troops were converging on the dock. The commandos were running out of ammunition. Lieutenant Colonel Newman made the decision to break out and attempt to escape inland. Small groups of commandos fought their way out of the port into St. Nazaire's streets, hoping to reach the countryside and possibly make contact with French resistance. The breakout failed. German forces surrounded the commandos in the town. House-to-house fighting erupted. The commandos were overwhelmed by superior numbers. By 06 hours, most had surrendered or been killed. A few escaped into the countryside but were hunted down by German patrols over the next few days. Of 265 commandos who participated in the raid, 169 were killed or captured immediately. Only a handful made it back to England. Lieutenant Commander Beatty was captured on the dock after attempting to escape in one of the motor launches. He and his men became prisoners of war. Beatty expected to be executed, ramming a destroyer into a dock while disguised as a German ship arguably violated laws of war. But German officers respected the audacity of the raid. Beatty was treated as a prisoner of war, not a war criminal. By 08 hours on March 28th, the raid was over. St. Nazaire was secure. German forces controlled the port. HMS Campbeltown sat wedged in the dock gates, captured intact, a trophy of German victory. Senior German naval officers toured the destroyer, inspecting the damage and marveling at British audacity. Wehrmacht troops posed for photographs on the deck. Nobody knew the ship was packed with 5 tons of explosives set to detonate at 10:30 hours. British prisoners, including Beatty and Newman, were held in buildings near the dock. They knew the explosives would detonate soon, but couldn't warn their captors without violating operational security. Even as POWs, they were bound by orders not to reveal the true purpose of the raid. So they said nothing and waited. At 10:35 hours, the bow of HMS Campbeltown exploded with a blast that was heard 50 miles away. 5 tons of amytal detonated simultaneously, vaporizing the front third of the destroyer and obliterating the dock gates. The southern caisson gate, a steel structure weighing 1,500 tons, was blown apart. Fragments of steel were thrown hundreds of yards. The dry dock, which had been emptied of water by German engineers, was suddenly connected to the Loire River. Water rushed in, the dock flooded uncontrollably. The blast killed approximately 380 German soldiers and French civilians who were on or near the dock. Many were Wehrmacht engineers inspecting Campbeltown. Others were French dock workers who had been forced by Germans to help clear debris from the raid. Senior German officers touring the destroyer were killed instantly. The explosion was so powerful that it shattered windows across St. Nazaire. A mushroom cloud rose over the port. The German garrison panicked. Nobody knew if there were more bombs. Soldiers evacuated the port. French civilians fled into the countryside. Rumors spread that British commandos were still hiding in the town with explosives. German troops began randomly searching buildings and shooting anyone suspicious. In the chaos, several French civilians were killed by German soldiers who assumed they were British commandos in disguise. The panic was justified. The demolition charges set by commando teams began detonating hours after the main explosion. The pumping station exploded at 13 hours. The winding house exploded at 15 hours. Each explosion triggered more panic and more indiscriminate shooting by German forces convinced they were under attack. British intelligence monitored German radio communications and confirmed the explosion. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed St. Nazaire and confirmed the Normandy dock was destroyed. The mission had succeeded. The dock was unusable. The gates were obliterated. The pumping machinery was wrecked. Repairing the dock would take years, possibly longer than the war would last. Tirpitz never used St. Nazaire. The battleship remained in Norwegian waters for the rest of the war, unable to raid Atlantic convoys without a safe harbor for repairs. The threat that had tied down British naval resources was neutralized not by sinking the battleship, but by destroying the one dock she could use. Operation Chariot had achieved its strategic objective. The commandos and sailors captured at St. Nazaire spent the remainder of the war in German POW camps. They were not treated as war criminals despite fighting in German uniforms during the approach, a technical violation of laws of war. German military courts considered holding trials but ultimately decided the raiders were legitimate combatants who had used a ruse of war that, while deceptive, was not illegal. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty was held at Oflag 9AH, a POW camp for naval officers in Germany. He was interrogated extensively. German intelligence wanted to know how the British had obtained current recognition codes. Beatty refused to provide information beyond name, rank, and serial number. He spent 3 years as a POW, surviving until liberation in April 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman was held at similar camps. He attempted to escape several times, but was recaptured. Newman and Beatty both received the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration, for their leadership during Operation Chariot. The awards were announced in 1942 while they were still POWs. German camp commandants were required by Geneva Convention to inform prisoners of decorations. Newman and Beatty learned they had received the Victoria Cross from German officers who grudgingly respected the achievement. The survivors who made it back to England, approximately 25 men from 4 motor launches that escaped, were debriefed extensively. They provided detailed accounts of the raid, confirming which objectives were achieved and which weren't. Their testimony helped intelligence analysts assess the success of Operation Chariot. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded for Operation Chariot, more than any other single operation in the war. Newman and Beatty received VCs for leadership. Sergeant Thomas Durrant received a posthumous VC for manning a gun on a motor launch while mortally wounded, continuing to fire at German vessels until he died. Lieutenant Commander Robert Ryder, who commanded the naval force, received a VC for bringing the flotilla into St. Nazaire under fire. Commander Robert Nock received a VC for leading his motor launch through intense fire to evacuate commandos. The high number of VCs reflected both the extraordinary courage displayed during the raid and the strategic importance of the mission. Operation Chariot had accomplished what air raids and naval bombardments couldn't, permanently disabling the only Atlantic dry dock capable of servicing Tirpitz. German engineers surveyed the damage to the Normandy dock and concluded that repairs were impossible during wartime. The southern caisson gate was destroyed, the pumping machinery was wrecked, the dock structure itself was damaged beyond quick repair. Even if they could manufacture replacement gates and pumps, installing them required specialized equipment and months of labor. The dock was written off as a total loss for the duration of the war. The psychological impact on German planning was significant. The Audacious raid proved that British commandos could penetrate heavily defended ports and accomplish strategic objectives. Coastal defense requirements increased across German-occupied Europe. More troops were assigned to garrison duties. More resources were diverted from the Eastern Front to defend against potential raids. For Britain, Operation Chariot was a propaganda victory at a time when victories were rare. In spring 1942, Britain was losing in North Africa, losing in Southeast Asia, and enduring continued bombing at home. The St. Nazaire Raid was a bright spot, a bold, successful operation that damaged German capabilities. British newspapers celebrated the greatest raid. Morale improved. The raid demonstrated that Britain could still strike back. Strategically, neutralizing Tirpitz without sinking her was almost as effective as destroying the battleship. Tirpitz remained a fleet in being, a threat that tied down British resources, but she couldn't raid Atlantic convoys without St. Nazaire. The battleship made occasional sorties against Arctic convoys to Russia, but never broke out into the Atlantic. In November 1944, RAF bombers finally sank Tirpitz in a Norwegian fjord. By then, the battleship's strategic value had been neutralized for over 2 years, partially because of Operation Chariot. The cost was significant. Of 622 men who participated in the raid, 265 commandos, and 357 naval personnel on Campbeltown and the motor launches, 169 were killed and 200 captured. Only 228 returned to England. The 27% fatality rate and 32% capture rate were exactly in line with the pre-mission estimates. Everyone had known this was a suicide mission. They went anyway. Post-war analysis confirmed the raid's effectiveness. A U.S. Army historical study called Operation Chariot the greatest raid of all, and concluded it was one of the most cost-effective operations of the war. The loss of 169 men and 17 vessels destroyed a facility that would have cost thousands of lives to eliminate through air raids or amphibious assault. The strategic value neutralizing Tirpitz justified the casualties. Was Operation Chariot a success or failure? The answer depends on how you measure it. Measured by casualties, it was a disaster. 27% dead, 32% captured, only 37% returned. Any operation with those casualty rates would normally be considered a failure. Measured by tactical objectives, it was a success. The Normandy dock was destroyed. The pumping station was demolished. The winding houses were wrecked. The port facilities were damaged. Every primary objective was achieved. Measured by strategic impact, it was a triumph. Tirpitz never used St. Nazaire. The battleship's Atlantic raiding capability was neutralized. British resources were freed up. Convoy losses decreased. The strategic objective was accomplished completely. Measured by cost-benefit analysis, it was efficient. Destroying the dock through air raids would have required hundreds of sorties, months of effort, and potentially thousands of casualties. Capturing St. Nazaire through amphibious assault would have cost tens of thousands of casualties. Operation Chariot accomplished the same result with 169 dead, a brutal calculation but militarily sound. The commandos who survived generally believed the raid was worth the cost. They had volunteered for a mission they knew was suicidal. They accomplished their objectives. The casualties were horrific, but not unexpected. In post-war interviews, survivors expressed pride in the operation and believed it justified the losses. Critics argued that the raid was unnecessary. Tirpitz could have been contained through other means: air raids, minefields, submarine patrols. Risking 622 men to destroy one dock was excessive. Alternative strategies could have achieved similar results with fewer casualties. Defenders of the raid pointed out that alternatives had been tried and failed. Air raids on Tirpitz in Norwegian fjords achieved minimal damage. Submarine attacks were nearly impossible. The fjords were too well defended. St. Nazaire was the strategic weak point. Attacking it directly was the most effective way to neutralize the battleship threat. The German perspective was respectful. Post-war interviews with German officers who defended St. Nazaire revealed admiration for British audacity mixed with relief that future raids didn't match Operation Chariot's boldness. The raid had been terrifyingly effective. If Britain could execute operations like St. Nazaire, nowhere on the French coast was safe. Operation Chariot established combined operations as a viable strategic tool. Prior to St. Nazaire, Commando raids were considered harassment, useful for morale, but strategically insignificant. St. Nazaire proved that small, elite forces executing daring operations could achieve strategic objectives impossible for conventional forces. The raid's success validated the concept of special operations and influenced British and American planning for the rest of the war. The tactics developed for St. Nazaire were refined and used in later operations. The D-Day landings in June 1944 incorporated lessons from St. Nazaire: use of deception, precision timing, specialized demolition teams, acceptance of high casualties for strategic objectives. Many officers involved in planning Operation Chariot later planned sections of Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion. The raid influenced Commando unit development. The success demonstrated the value of elite, specially trained forces capable of executing complex operations in hostile environments. British and American Special Operations units expanded throughout the war. The Strategic Air Service, SAS, Navy SEALs, and other special forces trace conceptual lineage to operations like St. Nazaire. HMS Campbeltown's wreck remained lodged in the dock gates for years after the explosion. German engineers eventually removed the remains, but never fully repaired the dock during the war. After 1945, French authorities rebuilt the Normandy dock, which resumed civilian service in the 1950s. Today, St. Nazaire is a functioning commercial port. The dock still exists. Tourists can visit the site where Campbelltown rammed the gates in 1942. A memorial to Operation Chariot stands at St. Nazaire, commemorating both British raiders and French civilians killed during the operation. The memorial lists names of the 169 British personnel killed and acknowledges the German and French casualties from the explosion and subsequent panic. The text reads in French and English, "In memory of those who died for freedom." Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty survived his POW captivity and returned to England in 1945. He remained in the Royal Navy after the war, eventually retiring as a captain in 1955. He attended annual reunions of St. Nazaire veterans and spoke at commemorative events. He maintained that Operation Chariot, despite its horrific casualties, was strategically necessary and properly executed. Beatty died in 1975 at age 61. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman also survived captivity and returned to England. He left the military after the war and became a successful businessman. Newman was active in veterans affairs and advocated for recognition of commandos who died in the raid. He worked to ensure that French civilians killed during the explosion were properly commemorated alongside British casualties. Newman died in 1972 at age 62. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe and share this video. These stories matter because they show that courage is real, that impossible missions can succeed, and that strategic thinking sometimes requires brutal calculations about acceptable losses. Operation Chariot was the most audacious commando raid of World War II. 622 men sailed into one of the most heavily defended ports in Europe, rammed a destroyer packed with explosives into a dock gate, fought for 6 hours against overwhelming odds, destroyed every primary objective, and permanently disabled the only Atlantic dry dock capable of servicing the German battleship Tirpitz. 169 men died. 200 were captured. 228 made it home. The casualty rates were exactly what planners predicted. Everyone who volunteered knew this was likely a one-way mission. They went anyway because the strategic objective, neutralizing Tirpitz, justified the risk. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty brought HMS Campbeltown into St. Nazaire under fire, maintained course while his ship was being torn apart, and rammed the dock gates at exactly the right angle and speed. His crew held their positions while being killed around them. The commandos executed their demolitions under fire with professional precision. The motor launch crews evacuated survivors while being destroyed by shore batteries. Every element of the operation demonstrated extraordinary courage and discipline. The explosion that followed, killing 380 German soldiers and French civilians, was the largest non-nuclear explosion of the war to that point. The blast was heard 50 miles away. The dock was obliterated. Tirpitz lost her Atlantic safe harbor. The battleship never raided convoys. British resources were freed. The strategic objective was achieved completely. Was it worth 169 lives? The veterans who survived believed it was. They had volunteered for the mission knowing the odds. They accomplished their objectives. The raid shortened the war by removing a strategic threat that had tied down British resources for months. From a cold military calculation, Operation Chariot was one of the most cost-effective operations of the war. But the human cost was real. 169 families received telegrams informing them their sons, brothers, husbands, or fathers had been killed in action. The names are inscribed on memorials at St. Nazaire and across Britain. They died ramming a destroyer into a dock, fighting through a hostile port, or drowning in burning fuel oil while their motor launches sank. They deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as individuals who made a conscious choice to risk everything for a strategic objective they believed in. Visit St. Nazaire if you can. The dock still stands, rebuilt after the war. A memorial commemorates the raid. You can see where HMS Campbeltown struck the gates at 01:34 hours on March 28, 1942. The port is peaceful now, filled with civilian ships, no resemblance to the battlefield it became for 6 hours in 1942, but the memory remains. Thank you for watching. Please comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We preserve these stories because they show that impossible missions sometimes succeed, that courage exists, and that the outcomes we take for granted, like defeating Nazi Germany, were achieved through countless acts of extraordinary bravery by ordinary people who volunteered for missions they knew would likely kill them. The men of Operation Chariot earned their place in history. They deserve to be remembered